Alright guys, it's time to replace the radiator. I originally wasn't going to do this, but in designing the stock mount intercooler, I wanted to make sure it was going to fit with the Koyo N-Flo, because that's kind of what most people use these days. I used to use Fluidine all the time, but Fluidine no longer makes radiators for these, and after emailing them, they're not willing to make anymore. So, Koyo N-Flo is really the go-to these days for FDs. It's thicker, which poses problems for these cars. So as you can see, I already have all this pulled apart. If you don't know how to do this, there's other videos on how to do this. You can watch my intake install. But you got to pull out your intake, whether you got audio exe, the factory, or just filters, whatever. Pull that out, your stock mount intercooler, if that's what you have. That's pretty simple. There's 2 bolts down there. It's got 4 bolts that connect to the actual intake duct here. 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom. 2 on the bottom are the hardest to get to, but with like a stubby wrench, if you got a stubby 10mm gear wrench, the bottom ones are fairly easy to get on. 2 bolts here, bolt to right here. This AC dryer actually goes in there. It's got a bracket that bolts right here. You just loosen up, and then this just kind of bends out of the way, and this just comes out after you pull the intercooler out. So it's not too bad to pull all this stuff out, honestly. You do got to remember, you probably have an AST. Sometimes people delete it, and then you'd have just the hose off of here if you got like the T2 adapter. But that one pulled off as well. I already had this pulled off because again, I'm working on designing the kit. After that, you can see the radiator. It's fairly easy to get to. There's 2 mounts, one up here, one there. We'll get to that a little bit later. This bar also, you got 2 bolts here, 2 bolts here similarly. I find it easiest to pull that off. That way you just got some more space to work with. I actually don't think it's too necessary, but I'm pulling that off just because I 3D scanned it. That's what all the dots are for. And I'm going to go get that powder coated and freshen it up a little bit. But that is just a quick overview of the main stuff you got to pull out. And it probably takes about 20 minutes to pull everything out if you're good with tools and efficient. What you run into is, you can see the layout of the radiator. It sits at like a 45-degree angle. Due to the Koyo N-Flo being taller, the airbox sits pretty much right on top of this. So the N-Flo is actually about 1 inch thicker, so it raises everything. As the stock mount intercooler sits on top of these, I had to do some designing to make the intercooler work, because it sits right above these fans. So when you put a thicker radiator, it's initially going to run into the intercooler. Like I said, this is the biggest pain point, especially with the audio exe intake, because when this pushes on the bottom of the intake, then the intake raises, and then it rubs on your hood and scratches your carbon fiber intake. And that's the biggest issue with these. And there is a great thread on RX7 Club, which I'll put the link in here, on how to install this. I'm going to see if I can create the right thickness of mounts to drop it enough so the intakes fit, everything fits, without having to notch that out. Not to mention, these brackets are metal, and by dropping further, they actually rub on the frame of the car, which can create a rust point, which I do not like. So I'm trying to figure out a better way to make this work. I'll update later in the video, see if I can come up with something. But those are just the main pain points of the Koyo N-Flo. It's not a direct drop-in. Technically it is, but you have to worry about these small issues. So the first thing you want to do after removing all the main stuff that's up here, including the battery and whatnot, there's also typically a bar right here, but I have that off already and sent to powder coating. You usually don't even have to remove that because everything's in front here. It might give you a little bit more space just to work with. These are your AST hoses here. I'm going to be relocating the AST over here just because I'm doing the SMIC kit. You can also delete the AST if you'd like and just go to like a T2 style filler neck here. and that just goes over to your overflow tank. But obviously you want to drain the coolant first. Remove your upper and lower radiator hoses here, and radiator mounts, 10 millimeter there, 10 millimeter down here. Get some better lighting in a minute. I usually have brackets for here as well, but this thing you have to pull out anyway just to get the intercooler duct out, and then this bends out of the way. Be gentle with this though, because it is aluminum lines. There's Freon in here. Don't be yanking around too much. Aluminum only bends back and forth so many times before it starts getting fatigued and cracking. So only bend it away just enough to pull that out and to work with. It will move out of the way. Now to pull the radiator out, you can leave the fans on or you can take them off while it's in here. I prefer to take them off just to have more room to work with. So after I get these hoses off, then there's 3/8 10 millimeter bolts up here on top of the radiator. One right there, and I believe there's one right there. Then you can lift the top out and pull them out. Don't forget to unplug it. Plug is right here. So let me get that done real quick. These are the hoses for the AST that goes to the bottom of the radiator. I'm also replacing all the coolant hoses. You know, you got your coolant hose down there. You got your throttle body coolant hoses, your heater core. I'm doing a full refresh on this thing. That way I don't have to do it for a very long time. Alright, so I got the hoses pulled off. Got these bolts pulled off for the shroud. I'm going to have to clean up these necks. You see a lot of old coolant schmegma here. Not very sightly, but I'm going to get those cleaned up. Shroud is loose. I'm going to get this lifted out. Again, you're going to have to work around your AC dryer. Everything's unplugged. So let me lift this out and we'll move on. Alright, got the shroud off. I did have to take this lower hose off in order to... You got to pull the shroud up and pull it out of these little holders there. Then you got to raise the back, shift it down. That way you can lift it out to clear the upper neck there. And then it comes right out. Just pull this out of the way and it comes out fairly easy. You see I didn't really damage any fins or anything. Be ultra careful putting it back in with the new one so you don't mess up your fins. So it's all preference if you want to put it in with the shroud attached to the radiator or not. I'll leave that up to you. If you hear me preach about ducting and stuff, this is something else you also want to replace when doing radiator. This is the factory foam. You can see this isn't in the best of shape because I was already messing with the brackets and this is old and falling apart, but you definitely want to replace this because as you can see, when the fresh air comes through, it's going to bypass the radiator instead of forcing the air through the fins and the heat exchanger here. It's going to just come right in the engine bay. So order this on Amazon. It's super cheap. It's something you definitely want to replace. Here's a better shot of how the mounts go. This is a picture of the mount that goes under there. So it's a stud that goes in. That spaces it off of there and lifts the radiator accordingly. So like I mentioned before, people do take this completely out and let this go all the way down. But like I said, right now it won't push all the way down because of that plastic piece that it's hitting right there. So I'm going to address that here in a little bit with the new N-Flo and see what I can come up with a custom mount. That way it's not bottomed out and it's also low enough to work with everything. So with everything out, all the bolts unhooked, it really is just as simple as lifting it and clearing that. The only thing it hits is here. So again, you got to pull that out and lift it straight out. But you can see it comes right out of the mounts and you're ready to go. So let me go ahead and pull this out. All right, so here we got the radiator pulled out. One thing I like to point out is these lower radiator mounts. We're going to have to bend these tabs down a little bit to fit the thicker Koyo. But I'm actually going to be replacing these. Often these things are the lowest part on the car, or one of the lowest in the front, and people bang them. It also doubles as a sway bar mount. So these are often bent. I ordered a set just to be safe. Thanks Ray Crow for that. He's definitely helped me out with parts for the last 20 years, and he always comes through. But keep that in mind when you're doing this. Everything else looks pretty good. This bracket here is the one that always comes into consideration when people talk about flipping brackets. They misunderstand and think they're talking about flipping the radiator brackets to go here, but that's not the case. This one I already flipped just for fitment purposes, designing the stock mount kit. This is typically flipped the other way. These right here are the radiator mounts. You are going to have to pull these off the old radiator and transform to the new radiator. The older Fluidigns and some of the other ones had these actually welded on, so you didn't have to reuse these, but these do go on the new Koyo N-Flo. Here's where I'm going to take some measurements to see exactly where the bulk of the expansion is. The coil is about an inch thicker than this, I believe. I'll do some measurements here in a minute just to confirm, but I don't believe it's equal either direction. I think it's more so one direction than the other, but we'll find out here in a minute. This is all stuff I need to document and figure out so I can make some custom mounts in order to drop it and keep some vibration isolation rather than just lowering this metal piece to the actual cross member there. So here's the Koyo N-Flo and the factory radiator right next to each other. Koyo's makes a good product. I've been using their stuff for years. Have the same radiator, and the 240 works excellent. Like I said, with the FDs, I used to use Fluidine just so you don't have to deal with these extra dimensional hurdles. The end tanks are actually very similar in size. I think this is around 2 inches and this is like 2 1/4. So these aren't the main problem. Main problem is the core is actually twice as thick, which in turn raises these fans. And that means you have to raise the fans in the engine bay, and it's already kind of tight under there. So that's where the main problem comes in, because you can see where it mounts. The mount is actually towards the top, whereas it's in the center in the factory one. So the bulk of the N-Flo is actually going towards the bottom and towards the AC condenser, which is why you have to rotate that bracket for the AC condenser. But because the core is thicker, you do have to raise the fans by that much. That's where you run into your issues. So I am still working on the dimensions on how far to drop these down. I'm playing with the idea of making some new brackets. I'm going to reuse these, but I'm going to change. I'm going to design and change some of the actual rubber mount that's here, the isolator, and I'm probably going to cut that in half, install things, and see if that's the right size, because I do want to have some kind of vibration dampening on this instead of just mounting this to the core support there. And like I said, this thing actually touches metal to metal as well. I have thought about designing this and raising this to drop the radiator so you can use a factory mount. I'll play around with some ideas. I did make some new mounts there at a high temp TPU. They should be able to hold up just fine. Factory ones, you know, they're 30 years old. I think those are like 15 bucks a piece. So since I have that capability, I was able to just reverse engineer and make my own. It's stronger than rubber. Probably not as much vibration dampening, but it should last longer and still give you vibration dampening. But there you have it. Those are the comparison. I did add the foam you need there for directing the air through the radiator, not letting it go around. You can see the old foam is just deteriorated. It was in a lot better condition before I started pulling out messing with it. I didn't really have many holes, but that's what happens when you start touching 30-year-old hot foam. The other thing is, Koyo does have a provision for a temp sensor, which I'm going to try to utilize. I have DEFI gauges. This is, I believe, 1/8 NPT, and the DEFI is going to be a standard PT or the BSPT. So I'm probably going to have to get an adapter. I'm going to put this in the car first and make sure I have room for an adapter, make sure it's not going to lift it and then hit the core support or something. But I would like to be able to utilize this rather than cut my brand new hose in half and use the temp sense adapter that's currently in there. There we got the new radiator mounts put in. And these are what you need to bend down just ever so slightly to account for the little bit thicker core so it doesn't rub through on those. There's a bracket right here. I'm going to have to trim the foam a little bit to make sure it fits. The foam is pretty tight over here with these lines. Same thing. That's the hardest part about getting the radiator in right now is the foam. I like to have a good seal. You can get softer stuff, but this stuff won't let any air past. So unfortunately, To lower it down as much as I want to lower it down, I am going to have to trim this plastic piece here on the bumper to clear the radiator. You can see it hits here, and it's not even all the way down. That's about where it sits with the factory isolator, but I want to lower it down even further than that just to give me plenty of clearance. You can see it's closer to the condenser on that side than it is here because it's resting on this plastic piece right here. Here's what I'm talking about from this angle. Just touching that lip. So I'll have to trim that just a little bit to let the radiator fall, and you can see how much space we have until it bottoms out to the mount. So the factory isolator fits right in that spot, and that's about the right height for that, but in order to drop it down below, I'm going to have to trim it. Let's see how much closer that one is. So even with the shroud trimmed, I'm still running into the issue with this bracket hitting the actual core support there. So I can't get it all as far down as I would like. And I think I'm going to make my own custom brackets to drop it down. Now, this is not necessary to install the radiator. This is only to drop it down to where I would like it to be. You can use a factory mount and everything will fit. So this is technically a bolt-in, but I want this thing to fit the best it can with the new stock mount that I'm running, as well as other stock mounts that run into the same issues and intake kits and whatnot. Additionally, on this side, the radiator is super close to the condenser, a little closer than I want, so I'm actually going to print some spacers to drop the condenser mount on this side so I can drop the condenser down about 5 millimeters. You can see the space difference because this side was dropped from that bracket. I just want to keep it equal. Here you have my new radiator mounts. I'm reusing the factory isolator, that way I can get some vibration dampening. My new mounts drop the radiator another about 5 millimeters, and that way I can still have the clearance and factory fitment. The problem with the radiator mounts isn't necessarily just the weld right here. The weld is kind of alright. It's about the same thickness as like this little clip you bolt to. But if you look, it tapers away. This little section does. And that's where the factory bracket is a little bit too wide and it actually sits on this taper. So the bracket sits kind of at an angle like this. So my new bracket just goes up to this weld. It might go right on the weld, but it's about the same thickness as here. So you get a more ideal mounting point right there. And it's not sitting there rubbing on your side tank the whole time. So here's what I'm talking about with the factory bracket, how it sits. You can see how wide it is, and it sits down on that weld. And it's not able to really sit on the radiator how I like it to. I mean, it fits all right, but I think designing my own does better. Fits all right there, but it sits at kind of an angle that direction. And I'm also, with my new brackets, I extended this about 5 millimeters. That way it'll drop the radiator down just that much and give us that much more space. And then we can still use the isolator down there and have vibration dampening, which I think is very important. Here you have the factory bracket next to the bracket I've made. And you can see the length difference where the hole is. And you can also see the thickness difference right there, and that's where it's not going to be sitting on the weld. These are stainless. I made these out of stainless, but I wanted them powder coated because this is mounting to the aluminum radiator, and I didn't want corrosion. Here you can see with the new bracket, it just clears that top part of the weld, so it no longer sits on that angled piece, and that's exactly what I was going for. I don't know if you can see it there. Looks like factory, nice and clean, and then I can drop the radiator how I want without removing that isolator, which a lot of people tend to do. And here we have the finished product of my radiator mount. You can still see we have the isolator there. Drops the radiator down just a little bit more. You do have to cut this piece above the radiator. I was hoping not, but that's the only way to get it to drop more, because with the factory mounts, you're just touching that. Another thing I'd like to point out is if you do use the coolant temp sensor like I am, you have to trim your shroud, because usually there's this little piece right here that your radiator fan clips into with that little clip in this rectangle hole, and it fits right there. So if you don't have a sensor there, it's just a plug and it will fit with the shroud, but you see how to trim the shroud just to make the sensor come out, because it comes above it. So one thing to keep in mind. So then make sure to zip tie this up somewhere where it's going to be safe. With my new radiator mounts, you do have to bend this tab down quite a bit more than typical with the N-Flo, and I would actually recommend cutting this off at the weld. You are able to bend it down far enough. You just don't want that touching the radiator, because that'll eventually rub through the aluminum and you'll get a leak. But since it angles the radiator down a little bit further, you do have to bend this down further than normal, which is fine with me. Radiator's sitting better than it was before. I got more clearance, but that's one thing to note with my new radiator mounts. With my new condenser mounts, I got a nice even space between the condenser and the radiator now. So I'm happy about that. That's just one little thing that always bothered me about just flipping the one bracket. Making sure the temps are doing good. It's about 87 degrees today, and doing well.